Well, the title of this talk is Power, Politics, Prosperity, What's New After COVID? Now, I set myself this question or title, so it's really my fault if it's defective. And I'm going to begin by saying that in one respect, it is defective. What's new after COVID? Well, are we after COVID? I'm not sure. We have the arrival of the Delta variant, originating in India, but we don't want to call it Indian, do we? Because that might offend somebody. So instead we stress that it really developed in Britain. We know Britain is really the cause of so many problems in Europe. So there's this Delta variant, and at least it has served as a useful occasion for some Franco-German entente in forcing British tourists to quarantine. Obviously, the main losers from that would be the European tourist industry, but that obviously doesn't really bother too much the European leaders. At least it inflicts some pain potentially on Britain. Will we all have to have a third jab? How will that fit in with our flu jabs? Because it's quite reasonably said that there was so little flu this last year because of the controls that were applied over COVID, that it is likely that there will be an upsurge of flu this year. So is this going to go on and on and on? Well, it might. But there's one good reason why it shouldn't, and two reasons, which are rather bad reasons, why it might. Well, the good reason why it might not just go on and on is because we do have this vaccine. And enormous progress has been made with vaccination, particularly in Britain, but elsewhere too. In America, Italy has got 62% of its population vaccinated, Spain 57%, Greece 47%, but Croatia has a rather low percentage of vaccinated population at 43% of adults. And I think perhaps more surprisingly and worryingly, only 53% of those over 80 are vaccinated in Croatia. Well, this shows that something is wrong. And I would suggest that it's quite legitimate to have a target, a health target of, let's say, 70% of the adult population vaccinated. And I don't think that is a socialistic view. You might use socialistic methods to get it, and it would be better not to. But overall, having a health target of that sort seems good to me. Not least because if we can get to what is called, there are different meanings given to it, herd immunity, we ought to get some kind of stability, and we ought to be able to open up and get the economy moving again. So that's one reason why perhaps it won't go on and on and on. And yet, you know, I think that it is more likely that it will go on and on and on. And there are two reasons for that. The first may seem a little harsh, but it is this, and it is that a lot of people have done really quite well out of the pandemic conditions, and they would like to keep them going. Now, that's not to say that somebody is going to find a new deadly virus to do it. Really, I don't think one needs to be a madman to think that that is a possibility. But you don't need to think that. You just need to consider that there are vested interests in international organizations, in national government, of course in healthcare departments, and in business, particularly, of course, the drug companies, but other businesses as well, which are very strong in maintaining the present post-COVID or semi-COVID situation. Well, how should one deal with that? Well, I just want, en passant, to say one way that I don't think we should deal with the problem of the power of the drug companies, which is part of this of this complex which has an interest in keeping the thing going. I don't think that we should attack patents. Now, patents are, along with joint stock companies and limited liability, those three concepts really, these are crucial to the development of Western enterprise from, I think, about 16th, 17th century on, and then developed. But particularly patents, of course, guarantee intellectual property rights. And that without that kind of guarantee, we're not going to have new inventions, and these new inventions will not be properly applied. So I would just say that I think that any attempt to deal with the interests of drug companies by crushing and abolishing patents would be a bad thing. But to get back to the main theme, power is addictive. If you look at the British government's comings and goings in the last few weeks, you might also think that it is an aphrodisiac, but in more boring ways than those demonstrated by Britain. We can say that all of those who apply controls in some way benefit from them. I mean, we can just think about it in Croatia. Politicians, both national and local, are able to spend hours and hours on television, and people actually listen to them. They actually look at them. They think they've got something useful to say. This is quite rare. Medical experts, of course, are listened to as never before. In Britain, though not, I'm glad to say, in Croatia, but in Britain, the police are more important than they've ever been before. These have been, the British police have been given new social functions which allow the British police legally to approach people who are outside and that the police do not think have a right to be congregating outside their own homes, to force them to go back into their homes, to accompany them, to look inside, to find out how many members of their own families or people other than their own families are actually there. And if the police think that they have breached one of the many regulations, they can impose on-the-spot fines, even if you are only associating with members of your own family. Well, it used to be said that an Englishman's home is his castle. It was an old cliche, but quite an important one. Well, I can only say there aren't many castles left. Well, the second bad reason that we can imagine that all of this can continue is that populations, and here I'm thinking particularly about Western populations, have become more or less cowed into servitude. There are some nice paradoxes here when we want to think about them. The West invented the Enlightenment, and the enlightened West since has liberated itself from just about every inhibition. Of course, every superstition, and among these superstitions that they have liberated from themselves is religion, Christianity, the fear of God. And in this liberation have lain the seeds of slavery. Because the new fetish is health. And the only recognized enemy, because of course death is seen as final, is indeed death. So everything in society, in politics and so on, can, it is believed, be sacrificed if people are able to live. Not, of course, the unborn, that's a different matter. They're allowed to die. But anyway, in Western values nowadays, everything can be sacrificed otherwise if people are able to live. So legislatures have effectively been suspended. What were regarded as fundamental rights have been ignored. Families have been separated, and indeed their lives criminalized. And opinion polls show, there's a little movement on this now, but opinion polls show that most people, by and large, want still more of this control. Now, having said all this, I'm not actually going to argue that everything is different because of COVID. The thesis instead that I want to advance to you is summed up in that well-known French epigram, elegant and irritating at the same time, like so many delightful French people. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This expression, of course, contains a manifest self-contradiction, because in theory things cannot both change and stay the same. But in the case of post-COVID, they actually can, because while COVID has brought changes, as I've mentioned, their main effect is to reinforce trends which were already becoming dominant. So let's look at my three topics in reverse order. So first, prosperity, second, politics, and third, power, before coming to some conclusions and to some extent also ending with just questions. So first of all, prosperity. In other words, the effect of the COVID crisis on economies. Well, we shall not know the full effect of that for a while yet. The sharp downturn is bound to be followed by a spurt of growth as soon as some degree of normality returns. And that, as I've said, depends more than anything else on the success of vaccination programs. Now, Britain was outside the incompetently administered European Union, and so it quickly vaccinated its population. It's already seeing the economic benefits. In 2020, the UK economy contracted by a record 10%. This year, the forecast is for 7% growth, and next year, 5.5%. And other countries will see a similar pattern. There are various optimistic predictions made for Croatia, which I think may actually err on the side of optimism, but we'll see. The US will certainly take off. Generally, other heavily regulated economies are going to grow more slowly. But the striking recovery story is, of course, China. China. Now, you can't believe much that comes out of China by way of information, but it does appear from various sources that in 2020, the Chinese economy still grew by 2%. And this year, that it will grow by 8%. Well, does this mean that the combination of a police state with a free economy is the best model? Well, I must say I don't think so, but it's reasonable to suppose that some Asian countries might be persuaded of that. Now, these various figures about economic growth, they shouldn't be allowed to suggest to us that all is fine, either in the UK economy or elsewhere. Joseph Schumpeter famously talked about the gales of creative destruction. That is the process whereby economic crises shake up existing structures, reshape relationships, redeploy capital, and as a result, economies take an exponential leap forward beyond what would otherwise have occurred. But some of these Schumpeterian gales are more creative than others, and some of these gales are not creative at all. For example, and drawing here on my own experience, the sharp recession in the early 1980s in Britain under Margaret Thatcher did have, we can say, creative consequences. And they had creative consequences because British industry was so overmanned, because working practices were so archaic, because companies were losing money but being propped up by the state, and because all of business was in one way or the other being propped up by artificial demand created by inflation. And after a traumatic shakeout from about 1986, the British economy, in a new and stronger manner, did indeed leap forward. By contrast, the outcome of the 2008-2009 financial and economic crash didn't, in Britain at least, but I suspect this is true elsewhere, it didn't result in any underlying increase in productivity at all. Bailing out the banks, which were thus able in turn to bail out companies, retained jobs, but it did so at the expense of restructuring. And that restructuring would have occurred anyway at about that time because of the cyclical recession that accompanied but was overshadowed by the financial crash. Now, the outcome of this COVID crisis, I suggest, is likely to be far, far worse. Governments and national banks, including the European Bank, have together stepped in to fund the anti-COVID measures as if they were funding a war. And I'll come back to this parallel. I think it's really the most relevant, as if they were funding a war. But out of the devastation of a war, a great world war, like the Second World War, a new economic order can arise, and indeed did arise in the 1950s, with huge increases in productivity. But not so this time. Well, the figures really are mind-boggling. In 2020, the UK government borrowed £300 billion. Now that's 6 times more than in the previous year. And as a result, public debt stands at about 100% of GDP. In 2008, for comparison, public debt stood at just 35% of GDP. But I would then say it began to rise with higher public expenditure and had reached 85% by 2019. Now, the UK government's financial and fiscal interventions therefore illustrate my point, namely that COVID has accelerated what were existing trends. Boris Johnson's government had already abandoned any attempt to control public spending and borrowing before the pandemic. And this was in pursuit of working class votes in the north of England, but that needn't concern us. It was also the result of his belief, not founded, I should say, on any knowledge of economics in his case, that wealth is most easily created by public spending on large infrastructure projects. Boris's view was echoed in various degrees and ways by President Trump. Now, President Trump, too, liked the combination of economic nationalism, to which he added a certain amount of protection that Boris Johnson is not really interested in, but also both of them are really keen on that wonderful word, infrastructure. But all of this is endorsed with frenetic enthusiasm by President Joe Biden. So far, Biden has released 3 huge plans for spending on infrastructure, on families, and on COVID relief. Now, these 3 titles are really beguilingly persuasive, but underneath each of these titles lies something that the Americans call pork, which is actually lots and lots of programs which are concealed under these headings in order to bribe the electorate with their own money, which shows why each of these is, to prolong the metaphor, as fat as pigs. And the total of this threefold program is $6.4 trillion, I emphasize trillion dollars. Now, just for comparison, the figure for American military spending in the Second World War, if you adjust it for inflation, comes out at $4.9 trillion. In other words, substantially less. Well, the new statism that all this manifests is hardly ever challenged. Hayek, you may remember, dedicated his book, 1944, the road to serfdom to what he called the socialists of all parties. Well, I think he could now have added to that, and of all countries. It's just assumed that prosperity is created by government rather than the private sector. It's also assumed that in today's world there is no risk of higher inflation, and assumed that higher interest rates won't be introduced, which will jeopardize the expected growth. Well, there's a further economic trend which was discernible before COVID, but has been greatly accelerated by it. The narrative has been around for some time now that working conditions must be, as it said, humanized, and that what's called the work-life balance, it's an extraordinary suggestion that somehow work isn't really part of life, but anyway, that the work-life balance should be shifted in favor of the latter life. And the assumption is that all this can be done without lower living standards. Well, we've seen now this operating in practice. Not just in Britain, but throughout much of the rest of the world, working from home was made compulsory. There's some rowing back from that now, but still new laws are being introduced which will make working from home a norm and perhaps ultimately the norm. Attention has been given in the press, as you may have seen, to the effects of all this on big cities, where the destruction of city centres, the businesses and shops and so on there, has proceeded apace and will not recover, of course, while people are not in the city. Well, they're not in the office and they're just working at home. But much more important, I think, and not much discussed, is this. It is that there are very good reasons why offices came to exist. They came to exist because by working in offices, people acquire a relationship with the business as a whole rather than being extraneous to it. People working together are generally more productive than people working alone. There are a limited number of exceptions to that. I think one is those who are involved in what can be called pure creative work. But generally speaking, it is true that we need to bounce ideas off each other in order for the ideas to be good. It's also true that people can more easily protect their interests if they're in an office. So the trend to working from home will certainly slow down productivity growth. In the short term, of course, it may allow some savings for businesses as they sell off some property. But it's also, over time, going to lead to lower incomes. And it's extraordinary to me that our trade unions have not really cottoned on to this. So we have, in fact, 3 experiments being undertaken here. The first one is based on the assumption that government planning and intervention in the economy is going to be productive. And that, of course, is contrary to the experience of decades of socialism. The second experiment is based on the assumption that printing money will generate demand without generating price rises. And the third experiment is based on the assumption that disrupting existing relationships and weakening management and management control in companies is not going to have any bad effects on efficiency and productivity. Well, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose is applicable also in a wider setting, and that is of international organizations. And this is where the politics, my second topic, starts to intrude. Nowadays, I think it's fair to say that the most important political conflicts are not between traditional political parties offering different solutions to national problems. I think the most important political conflicts today are over conflicts over an agenda set internationally, which is opposed nationally. So in this new politics that we're seeing, it's not so much traditional left versus traditional right, as parties, and of course NGOs funded by George Soros and internationalists, some of which NGOs actually transform overnight into parties like Mojima, versus nationalists and populists. And I think we can see, indeed I mentioned Mojima, Croatia is rapidly going this way too. Now, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, actually. I think there are conspiracies. Different conspiracies work against each other. As an Englishman, I'm inclined to think, as the old phrase is, that most bad events are the result of, not of conspiracy, but of cock-up. But there certainly are conspiracies. It's just that you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see what I'm just about to say. And this is that there is a globalist agenda today. And that this globalist agenda is being pursued by an elite which has access to huge resources and which is quite uninhibited by any public scrutiny or accountability. Now, COVID is being exploited to advance the plans for what is called in the jargon a Great Reset. Great Reset, which is the name of the program championed by the Davos World Economic Forum. Now, its main components are threefold, and you'll have to forgive the jargon. I don't forgive them the jargon, but I didn't invent it, so you'll have to forgive me. So its main components are, first, the stakeholder economy, under which, in short, companies primarily serve extraneous interests rather than serving the shareholders that own them, and pursue other objectives than profit. The second component is known as sustainability, a phrase which evokes climate problems, lack of green diversity and so on, but which I think we should see most importantly as involving the rapid elimination of carbon emissions, which means basically an end to gas and coal use. And then the third component is ending inequality or poverty. Now, no distinction is actually drawn between these two, inequality or poverty, though they are intellectually and practically quite different things. And that this inequality and poverty are to be dealt with through the harnessing of what is called a fourth industrial revolution. Well, historians have been arguing about industrial revolutions for just about as long as anybody's been writing modern history. First, second, can't remember what the third is actually. But anyway, the first and two have evoked enormous amounts of argument. And then before that, if we're short of argument, we can go into how on earth and why we got the agricultural revolution and what its connection was with the first industrial revolution. Anyway, this so-called fourth industrial revolution is meant to deal with all of these problems. But what we ought to concentrate on is how it's going to be done. It's all going to be done by continuing massive government intervention. It's going to involve a reduction of living standards in many countries. And it's going to require the rule of experts rather than national politicians. And COVID, and the whole of this crisis, has softened us all up for the application of this reset program. Now, whether that softening is going to be sufficient, frankly, I rather doubt. Boris Johnson is a born-again climate activist. His rebirth as a Green occurred when he decided to share his life with a partner committed to preserving the planet. There was no evidence of it being a feature of his awareness before that. But anyway, The British government, since then, has led the way, as it is said, internationally in declaring targets for net zero carbon emissions. And emissions have indeed fallen some way, and of course they've fallen a bit further because of the lockdowns over COVID. But still, the obstacles for the accelerated plan that's been announced really are daunting. And they haven't been addressed. The British government has not begun explaining to the public how much it's going to cost to replace gas-fired boilers with heat pumps, which are very much less efficient. The government has not explained to people how those who are living in the countryside are going to manage exclusively by running electric cars. The government has not explained what's going to happen to stock farmers, restaurant owners, and even those of us who like a pork chop when we simply can't get meat. Now, the only hope of enforcing that agenda in a democratic country is simply that the populace has been made too servile to object, and arguably COVID will have helped in this. Now, this is a problem for the future, but not, I think, the distant future. Well, the political effects of COVID have varied with time. Initially, you can say that governments were given the benefit of the doubt. As in a war, again, that's the parallel, it was seen as unpatriotic to complain. And as with so many wars at the start, it was thought that the whole thing would soon be over. And then the disappointment and frustration set in. In other circumstances, there's not much doubt that Donald Trump would have beaten Joe Biden at the presidential elections. But even in the US, the public became inclined to the arguments of the Democratic Party that controls were in the end more important than liberties. And of course, mass postal voting did the rest. As time has gone by, however, and especially since the vaccines have become more available, the public is more forgiving and less demanding. We're relieved, we're less frightened, so am I incidentally, but how long will all this benevolence last? Generally, where governments claim, and still claim, that they're simply following scientific advice, they can enjoy sometimes grudging majority support for what they decide to do. But this doesn't mean that they're going to escape scrutiny for past decisions, many of which we can now see were plainly wrong. People will also soon start to have to pay for the huge expenditure on COVID handouts with the imposition of tax increases. Now, perhaps the era of low taxes is gone. Perhaps people are going to be happy to be dependent on government. Some people suggest so. But even then, and I don't know that I do accept this, but even then the question is, as in the past, will government be able to meet the expectations of the people? So there's plenty of trouble stored up there. The European Commission. Well, the European Commission is currently having an easier run of things than it did a couple of months ago. It's managed to get back to persecuting the East Europeans and signing up to international utopianism, which are its preferred tasks. But it's hard to believe that the lethal incompetence which it showed in the business of acquiring and distributing vaccines will so easily be forgotten. Now, I'm careful about making political predictions, having been wrong on plenty of occasions. I'm not unique in that, incidentally. But while the general population in our countries continues to accept more or less what is given by the elite, well, of course, any political outcome is possible. But I do believe that there are limits to people's tolerance of this great reset agenda in all its manifest departments. I do believe that in different countries, that point will be reached on different issues, and that when it happens, the globalist elite is going to be in for a shock. Well, one political change of a different sort that flowed from COVID, I must mention, is this. It is the wholehearted conversion of the British public to deep hostility towards the European Union. This opposition, I can tell you, is much wider and sharper than at the time of the referendum. The success of the UK vaccination programme, which was only possible because Britain was outside the European Union, and the subsequent attempts of EU leaders to disrupt it, have effected a really big change in British public opinion. And I think that both France and Germany, on different occasions and at different stages, will discover the consequences of that. So that brings me to my third and my final topic, which is power. Power. Well, this topic of power has to be linked to the wider issue of mega business and the state. International drug companies are certainly part of all this power complex, but not just them. Mixed up with it all, and mixed up notably with the Black Lives Matter revolution in the United States and what's called cancel culture, are the big tech companies, the big tech companies. And big tech censorship is undoubtedly now far more powerful and far more controversial than it ever was. Now, the big tech companies and their owners and chief executives may feel as if they are the lords of the universe. But I think they're also now the prime targets. And prime targets not just for people on the right, but also people on the left too. And it's a very bad idea in business to make yourself a prime target. Now, something similar can be said, moving now on to the power of states, about China. China. Now, China's position has been both strengthened and weakened by the pandemic. The pandemic, let's remember, which China, caused, which it failed to alert people to, which it has never apologized for, which it has never been asked to provide any compensation for either. The Chinese economy, already the world's second largest, continues to surge ahead. Despite years of predictions that it would stumble, that's just not happened. The Chinese internal regional imbalances that people were discussing, I remember when they were discussing this under Mrs. Thatcher, these internal regional imbalances, they're quite unaddressed, but it doesn't really seem to matter much, does it? Contrary to what was predicted by the triumphalist liberals in the late 80s and 90s, like Francis Fukuyama, you remember him, the triumph of democracy, the end of history, and so on. The predictions of these people that economic liberty, rising living standards would make China freer, would make it more democratic, would undermine the party's monopoly, and so on. None of this has occurred. In fact, the Chinese now show less respect for human rights than at any time since Mao's Cultural Revolution. The Chinese persecute Christians and Muslims as vigorously as ever, and neither the Vatican nor the Middle East Arabs emits a squeak of protest. The Vatican repeatedly offers more concessions and never holds them to account. And as for the Middle East Arabs, they actually vote against international motions of censorship of the Chinese behavior towards the Muslim Uyghurs. Well, the Chinese also are at some point going to seek to take Taiwan. President of China has more or less said that just recently. And indeed, they have long been saying it. They're going to wait for a suitable time, and then they're going to do it. And they're going to dare the West to start a war on the matter, which of course we won't. And I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying we should know what's going to happen. The Chinese need to be understood. Mrs. Thatcher understood the Chinese, and to the extent I understand them at all, I understand them through her. In 1982, Remember, this was after the Falklands War, when Britain and Thatcher was standing high in the world. She went off to Peking to try to negotiate on the future of Hong Kong. And the proposal that the British made was basically this. It was, Britain had the island of Hong Kong in sovereignty, but it had the mainland territories leasehold. And what we were proposing was that that we would give up the sovereignty of the island, but retain administration under Chinese sovereignty of the whole show. And the Chinese were not going to wear it. There would have been many good economic, political reasons for them to wear it. It would have actually done more good to China because, in fact, there would have been more confidence, there would have been more investment coming into China. But no, Deng Xiaoping said to Mrs. Thatcher, we are going to take Hong Kong. And he said, you can make whatever proposals you like. When we want to, we will go in and take it. And she just said, well, then the world will know what China is like. Well, it sounds a bit of a feeble reply, but it's just about any reply you can, because we're not going to have a nuclear war with China over Hong Kong. But it's really worth saying this, that when the Chinese decide that it is in their national interest to do something, they do it. And they will go into Taiwan. Now, China has got plenty of problems. This one-child policy is going to lead to enormous demographic problems. In fact, a halving of the population in due course. Population is going to peak at about 1.4 billion, then it will decrease. Now, you may say 1.4 billion is quite enough people, but that really isn't the point. There are 2 points here. One is that the dependency ratio, the economic dependency ratio, becomes very tricky indeed for the Chinese. And secondly, that they will be overtaken in size, at least by India. But anyway, those are for the distant future. What we have to reckon is that the Chinese are powerful and that they are building up their defenses, and that their defenses, in fact, they spend as much every year as altogether Russia, India, and the other Asian powers. Well, despite changing the rhetoric, Biden is going to have to pursue more or less the same policy as Trump. I don't believe that Western powers are going to allow our businesses and our technology to migrate to China indefinitely. When we had to go groveling, in the case of Croatia, I have to say kowtowing, to Peking in order even to get masks to protect ourselves from the virus that the Chinese had carefully and kindly sent to us. I don't believe that that's going to be tolerable to Western countries, whoever runs them. And as I say, I don't believe that the West is going to continue to look kindly on China's defense build-up, which is concealed to some extent, but generally that our intelligence experts know about. And China is now exerting a far higher profile on the world stage. President Xi Jinping is adopting a far more threatening rhetoric than the wily old Deng Xiaoping would ever have adopted. And I think one result of this, though, that the Chinese, rather like the big tech companies, haven't probably taken into account is that British, and not just British, but Western public opinion has now become alert to this. And that perhaps we're seeing the conditions for a kind of new Cold War with Western popular support against China. And that perhaps a bigger issue is really, is it going to remain cold? Well, let me just say something about Russia in that context. Russia is not now a world superpower. It has nuclear weapons. It has a large population, albeit with many demographic problems. But it is a regional power. And we have to deal with it as a regional power. Regional powers, the idea that regional powers are safer to deal with and easier to deal with than global superpowers is quite wrong, actually, because regional powers are much more sensitive about what lies in what they consider their spheres of interest, and particularly in adjoining countries. So when I think Britain sent that warship into waters off Crimea, it was extremely stupid. It would, of course, be even more stupid if the Russians had reacted in too violent a manner, because it's worth recalling that Britain and Russia spend about the same on their defense. And, of course, Britain's economy is much bigger, substantially bigger. But anyway, Russia is a regional power, and we should leave them out of the international calculations, but be very sensitive not to provoke them. And then, of course, we turn to the United States. Now, the United States is undoubtedly the only global superpower. And what the United States does matters more than all of the rest of the world put together. Now, I have to tell you that I don't think this is always a good thing. But so it is. Most of the world was pleased when Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump. They saw it as a return to normality, and specifically to international engagement and predictability. And as I say, this change really, I think, was the result of COVID. But the result of the change has not mainly been anything on the international sphere, on the international realm. It's been internal. That the change to Biden and to a democratic control of the presidency, Congress, and Senate means that America has been plunged into grave difficulties. American society is now polarized, and it is chaotic. In America, the split is not just between those who think that President Biden is the legitimate president and those who think he isn't. It's a much deeper division between those who believe in and respect America's past and America's values, and those who don't. Now, respect for America's past and America's values are really what's held this very diverse country together through thick and thin since the American Civil War. And the new administration is going to do anything that is required to appease the left, the Democratic Party. Now, this, among other things which concern us, will involve intervention in the affairs of other countries that do not share the American left's approach to things like gender ideology. Moreover, I think it's difficult to imagine anything that would be more dangerous in this part of the world, that is Central Europe, Balkans, Southeastern Europe, anything more dangerous than the import of American-style grievance culture based on identity. Now, of course, in America's case, the identity is based on race, but it's quite easy to move from race to nationhood and ethnicity. And the number of wars that have been fought in Central and Eastern Europe over these issues well, they've been fighting wars over these issues before America was even created. So finally, the European Union. Well, COVID, I think we can say, showed Europe at its worst. And really no one was surprised, which perhaps is actually even more alarming. European solidarity did not survive the vaccine shortages for long. When even the Germans opt out and unilaterally procure their own vaccine, I think you then know that solidarity is just another boring word. Well, just a few points, and one could make more, but perhaps it would be cruel. I don't want to be cruel. The Eurozone is a failure. And only as far as I know, the Croatian government and Croatian National Bank think otherwise. The euro has not leveled incomes between its members of the zone. It hasn't promoted productivity, and it hasn't achieved harmony. In fact, to the contrary, the Germans resent paying for those they think are shirkers. The Southern Europeans resent the pressures that this places on them. The post-Christian liberal West hates, the word is not an exaggeration, hates and despises the Christian and illiberal East, namely us. And the language shown by the Dutch Prime Minister about Hungary the other day surely shows this. Telling the Hungarians that they have to kneel has, I can tell you, very rarely been a good tactic. And people from Vienna to just about every other, even Moscow, know that you do not tell the Hungarians to kneel. Well, Germany wants to get control of national budgets because it understands, and they're right on this, that monetary and fiscal policy have in the end to work together. And you can't just set the monetary policy without having regard to taxing, spending and borrowing. But the other countries, they want to decide on their own tax rates. And you can understand that too, because if you can't decide on your own economic policy, you can't decide on your own tax rates, what are you going to be arguing about at an election? Everyone knows that there's too much regulation in Europe, and that this has led to a constantly diminishing European share of world GDP. Now, Viktor Orban has pointed out, and I don't think it will have increased his limited popularity there with the people in Brussels and Berlin, that in 2001, 14 of the world's 50 largest companies were European, but today the figure is 7. He pointed out that of the world's 10 largest financial centres, not a single one is in the European Union. He pointed out that 30 years ago, the European Union was filing 7 times as many patent applications as China, while today, China files 14 times as many as the EU. Yet no one will say anything about this systematic decline, let alone do anything about it, and to mention it is generally regarded as un-European and therefore bad manners. But the British have always been bad-mannered. So there we are, the world after COVID as I dare see it. In many ways more of the same, in some ways worse, and with a lot of unresolved issues and uncertainties. There's no silver lining that anyone has yet identified in this COVID cloud, which, as I say, hasn't lifted entirely. But at least it's good to be alive to discuss it. Thank you.